Most heartfelt greetings and salutations, ladies and gentlemen. I eagerly welcome you to Sturgeon's most premier station, Dusklight Radio. While my brother Everett is still on vacation, I will be your host, the discerningly delightful, unpredictably unassuming, and decisively discreet Evelynn L. Blackwell. Thank you all for having me. Perhaps you know of us Blackwells? Down at old Grandpappy Crowley Blackwell's boathouse, we hosted one of the first ever fishing competitions to grace Mantis Bay. A lot of preparation went into the event, and it was bound to be one of the most popular competitions in all of Sturgeon history. Unfortunately, somebody spread the word to not only the local fishermen, but also all of the fish. When the day came for the competition, not a single fish was caught, though I believe 3 of the competitors were lost that day when the fish decided to rebel right back. Sad, sad day. Thank goodness Papa Kaya was there to collect the corpses, or it would have been a complete disaster. I'm actually not sure what happened to them, but at least the press didn't either. The entire competition was almost called off indefinitely, but we Blackwells are nothing if not persistent. A few NDAs and a very short guest list fix that problem right up. And this year we are proud to be hosting the 12th annual Mantis Bay Fish Catch on May 8th to... damn. Nobody tell the fish I said that. Anyway, I am not Dusklight's main host, but today I am its mostly dead counterpart. I'll be reading you tales that Everett and his wonderful many-legged runners collect from the far corners of Sturgeon and beyond. Some of them will make you laugh, some will make you cry, and some will create an etching of your soul and email it to your first ex. I'm not exactly sure how, but that's what it says here. I'll try not to read those ones. Listeners, ever since our last broadcast, Clu Blackwell, who you may remember as once being the statue outside of the Blackwell estate, but who has now gained sentiency due to the apocalypse approaching in about 8 to 66,000 business days, weather permitting, has not left the station. At first, they were just standing in the doorway, still as, well, a statue, aside from a few twitches and the occasional dolphin noise. It took a few hours for me to convince them to step aside so that I could leave, shouting things like, "I want to go home! Please let me see my family! I have a roast in the oven! Politics are all a ruse!" And, of course, the famous line from the hit movie Moana, "We are all iron cages made from flesh, barring our true selves from escaping," or something like that. It's been a while since I've seen that movie. Anyway, they eventually moved. Now they're just sitting in a chair in the corner, breathing slowly. It's actually kind of unnerving. Tabitha and Jackal Blackwell were both here earlier to help, but Tabitha merely screamed for about 2 hours before fleeing to fortify her cave shelters. Though whether that's because of the impending apocalypse or the 20-foot worm that's been chewing through her walls lately, it's hard to say. And Jackal took Clu up in a staring contest, which, considering Clu is blindfolded, has made it difficult to determine the winner. That was a few days ago, and since then, neither one has blinked. I think. Jackal certainly hasn't anyway. So, I guess I'll just have to get used to having a few visitors in here for a little while. Hopefully the screeching doesn't start again while I'm recording for y'all. Well, with that, it's time for our stories this evening. Both of our stories tonight have been written by a mysterious entity called Lucy K., who sources say is a conglomerate of spirits hovering around a cheap microphone, making uncoordinated buzzing noises and dissolving anything that enters through them into dust. "I'm just happy to be here," the front one says. "Hey, it's my turn," says the one on the right. "Won't you both shut up? I'm trying to sleep," screams one from the back. Then they all switch places and it starts all over again. The first tale is called Exposure, which follows a woman who is experiencing flashbacks from a traumatic childhood incident, so comes along with a trigger warning for depictions of PTSD. Viewer discretion is advised. The second story, called Price, is a classic ghost story gone wrong. The voice of Eric in that one is played by the dark somnium, Long May He Reign, and the rest is also read by Lucy. Jeez, that girl sure does love to talk, don't she? Special thanks must be given first to Mandy Moe for rendering my brother Everett in the beauteous image you see when you look at our page. Really, Everett? Beauteous? And to @Nishian on Twitter for gracing you all with my spiritual beauty. Lastly, our music is provided with permission by Cryo Chamber, Envato Elements, the Nobody YouTube channel, and the Dark Somnium with gracious thanks. If you enjoy these intros and want to see more, please ensure you've got notifications on and leave a comment for every video you encounter. With that, the sun has set and dusk has crawled into the studio once more. Whether you're working, prepping to sleep, or evading the formless void that will one day consume us all, Blackwell is here to soothe your ears and captivate your soul. Now, close your eyes and take a deep breath. The scene has been set and the light is on. It's time to walk towards it. Just yesterday, the 3 bodies of the Davis family were found burned beyond recognition in their own home. It was at 5:48 a.m. that 911 operators received Elena's call from inside the house, reporting the fire. First responders arrived within 20 minutes, but were unsuccessful in putting out the blaze until much later. Despite their best efforts, 43-year-old Dale, 40-year-old Elena, and their 9-year-old son, Patrick, had been trapped inside. Today, the story continues. Hell, you really watching this shit again? Lillian lifted her head with a small gasp, startled by the interruption to her flimsy focus. Darcy was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, a disapproving frown on her face that pulled at the wrinkles on her cheeks, making her look a few years older than she was. She tutted softly when there was no immediate response, crossing her arms as she glanced between the younger woman and the television screen. Now, you know to turn that thing off when stories like this come on up. It ain't good for you. Lillian frowned, but didn't argue. She simply glanced sulkily at the screen before lowering the volume. And though she didn't turn it off completely, it did fade a bit into the background. Darce, it's fine. I'm fine. Yeah, like hell you are, she muttered under her breath. But at least she didn't pry the remote out of her hands, and instead plopped down in the old armchair on the other side of the couch. Progress, Lillian thought, wryly. The truth was, her older sister had these concerns quite a lot, and she was never afraid to voice them. Lillian's therapist had told her that exposure would help the panic she used to feel, but Darcy had never trusted psychology much. She'd practically marched into the therapist's office herself, demanding to have a chance to show that no-good shrink a piece of my mind. She'd also been thoroughly unamused when Lillian had tried to point out that, given their line of work, they'd probably love that. Really, though, it was no surprise that Darcy didn't see things the way she did. She never had, not since they were children, but even less so after the accident. Sisters or not, genetics only made up part of the link between them. Environment and psychology, Dr. Harrison had explained, made up the rest. And Darcy, well, she just hadn't been there at the dividing point. She hadn't seen the flames. Seems to have already been said as Deputy Jill Manfield appeared at a press conference earlier today. The uptick in residential fires, she assured the press, is most likely the result of a recent drought that hit the area late last week. Deputy Manfield then advised the public to keep a fire extinguisher or water bucket nearby at all times. to keep your smoke alarms up to date, and to keep your phones close by to notify 911, where is your emergency? The operator asked, her tone calm and clinically professional in a way that almost made Lillian smile despite herself. How she missed the tone of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and how to handle themselves. 8749, Hillcrest Road, she whispered quietly into the phone, staring at the door in front of her. The small crack at the bottom was practically glowing by now, a sickly orange halo of light. You should hurry. There was silence on the other end for a moment. Lillian could swear that somewhere in the house she heard a support beam creak dangerously. The sound made her flinch and grip the landline tighter, but it wasn't the one she was truly listening for. She had to get out of here, but she couldn't. Not yet. Not until she'd covered all her bases. They were still in here, after all, still upstairs, still in the house, and she didn't know if the flames had reached them or not by now. Lily! Lillian jumped slightly, looking over in surprise. The glow behind her eyes had receded. She now only saw Darcy, glaring suspiciously towards her. What? What's the matter with you? Darcy demanded, and Lillian grimaced slightly. She'd gone back to frowning. Her sister frowned so much nowadays. You ain't the type to zone out like this. It's like I told you, you ain't fine. Stop telling me what I am and what I'm not, Lillian sighed, slumping back into her chair. I'm just thinking, okay? Thinking, Darcy repeated, scoffing softly and gesturing toward the TV. Right. I'm sure you are. And you wouldn't happen to be thinking about the... Yes, Lillian interrupted, unsurprised to hear herself sounding about as resigned as she felt. But not in the way you think. She waited for Darcy to argue, but when she glanced back over, she merely saw her sister sitting quietly, tight-lipped and waiting for an answer. They always do this, you know? She made an aborted motion toward the television screen again. They brush them off, blame them on the heat, the dry grass. Don't they know it could be more than that? At this, Darcy seemed to soften a little. Course they do, she said, reaching into the front pocket of her jeans to pull out a cigarette box. She placed one between her lips, but didn't light it. They got guys for that. They can tell if it was electrical or because of a storm or... Yeah, Lillian said, rather than making her finish the list. But arson still hung heavy in the air between them, even unsaid. She frowned down at her lap. In her peripheral vision, the white and pink scars that disappeared up the sleeves of her sweater shone underneath the lamplight. She fidgeted with the cuffs, trying to ignore the glare. I know, but... Well, I'm just afraid they'll miss something. If they ain't looking into it anymore, that means there ain't nothing to look into, Darcy said, firm and succinct. You shouldn't have to worry about it. These families, these fires, they don't got nothing to do with us. They ain't you. There was a sharp, popping sound, one Lillian recognized as the strike of a match. Her lungs froze in her chest, a muscle in her neck jumping as she braced herself for the heady, sickening mugginess of nicotine and... smoke. She could smell the smoke. Thought she'd be used to it by now, but this wasn't the same as her mom's cigarettes. This was the kind of smoke that made her lungs burn and her eyes water, and Lillian was unable to stop herself from taking a deep breath of it, her throat stinging. If she didn't leave the house soon, the ash would block her airway completely, assuming the flames didn't get to her first. This smell would stick to her, she was sure. It had happened before, and it would happen again. There was more to it, though. Another scent that made her almost giddy. It made her head spin and her heart race. The stairs were blocked. It was only a matter of time now. A cough brought her out of her head again, and she pursed her lips as she waited out the hacking sounds of her sister's slow demise. She kept her gaze fixed on the television screen, where a statistics analyst was discussing how many people died in dry heat-related fires per annum. They shouldn't bother with the measurement. You really should quit those. I'll quit when I'm dead, Darcy muttered, and Lillian rolled her eyes. You're such a hypocrite. To that, predictably, her sister had no reply. Instead, she thumped her chest to silence her lungs and asked gruffly, How's that shrink of yours? Mr. Happy? Dr. Harrison, Lillian corrected flatly. You must have really wanted to change the subject if you brought him up. That ain't what I asked. Lillian sighed, rolling her eyes up toward the ceiling. It was still a few beats before she bothered to answer. I don't see him anymore. You what? Don't say it like that, Lillian snapped, instantly feeling defensive. You hate him. Honestly, you'd think you'd be happy for once. She heard Darcy's breath hitch on the inhale, but Lillian didn't look over again. She simply scowled at the screen, idly rubbing the place on her arm where her skin changed its texture. But for now, funeral services will be held on the 18th, and many people have already stopped by to pay their respects with gifts and flowers. It just goes to show that in this community, even when tragedy strikes, the members of it continue to stand together in solidarity. We hope that this will be the last fire of the summer and the last to take so many lives. But stay vigilant and keep practicing fire safety standards for the sake of you, your loved ones, and your home. The home was burning up all around her. She just barely managed to make it out the back door, but she could hear the screams now, coming from inside. Screams of parents, searching for their child among the flames. I'm here, she whispered under her breath, a subconscious thought. As if in answer, one of the second-story windows above her exploded outward, the light of the flames reflecting off the shattered glass. Lillian took a step backward to avoid them, but she couldn't take her eyes off the way they glittered, struck by some kind of twisted awe. In the distance, over the roar of the flames and the popping of the wood and metal, she thought she could hear the whining of sirens. She turned away from them without a word. After all, they were too late. No one could save them now. Look, I didn't like the guy, sure, but he was helping you. Ain't that what you said last year? Darcy asked, and Lillian briefly closed her eyes. Sure, but I got the advice I needed, and now I'm fine, Darce. Really, I'm okay. And I believed that the last 30 times you said it, Darcy scoffed. Lils, if you dropped your shrink for some fool reason... I didn't! Lillian snapped, slamming both hands down on either armrest. The impact didn't hurt, nor did it sound particularly intimidating, but it did send a strange tingle up her burn-covered arm. He told me how to fix it, and I'm fixing it! I mean it! I really don't need any more help! I feel fine! Hell, I feel great! Darcy was quiet for a moment after that, and together they both turned to face the TV screen. The last of the flames were being shown now. It seemed to be some sort of time-lapse of the whole thing, or at least from when they first responded to when the flames were finally doused and snuffed out. Lillian rolled her bottom lip between her teeth and wondered how long it really took to be over and done with like that. Darcy's cigarette went out when the last of the smoke did. And first responders thank them for their service. This has been Holly Daniels, Channel 6 Sturgeon Eyewitness News. The camera faded out, only to reappear inside the news studio to focus on a different man and woman. They began to discuss the next story, something about a robbery down at Mantis Bay, but Lillian was no longer listening. She could only tolerate their voices for so long before she shut the TV off with a snap of the remote. The room was dipped into silence. Oh, come on, I was watching that one, Darcy protested, rolling her eyes. Your choice in stories is horrible, you know that? When she didn't answer, Darcy simply sighed and stood up, patting her on the shoulder as she passed. Fine, I'll leave you to it. But, Lils, can you at least consider going back? You seemed to like him last we talked. Now you just seem, I don't know, stuck in your own head. Lillian looked up at her sister. The worry line she often wore creased her features, but she found she was stuck on the reflection of her eyes instead. Embers, glass, the orange halos. I'll try, she said flatly, though she knew there was no need. Thanks for your concern. Oh, don't thank me for that, she huffed, patting her one last time before walking toward the kitchen. You know I'm only here because of that bitch Missy Chambers, but you also know that Mom and Dad wouldn't have wanted you to be reliving that damn fire for the rest of your life. Lillian made a small noise of acknowledgement, glancing after her sister. It was true that Darcy was likely only alive because she'd been at a birthday party for a girl she despised, Missy, back in middle school. The fire that claimed their parents, the same one that claimed the skin on Lillian's arms, her left side, her stomach, her thighs, her mind, was a brutal one. One she'd remember for a long time, and one that would have done much more damage had it not been for that ill-timed celebration. And even still, it tortured Lillian. In fact, it'd never leave her mind. Until Dr. Harrison, that is. Now that was no longer the fire she remembered. Before she'd left the house, she'd seen the bathroom door ajar. Lillian brought the oxygen mask up to her face to take a deep breath of the cold, crisp air, in stark contrast to the terrible heat around them. On the exhale, she started toward the door, carefully avoiding the fallen debris that had intersected the clear path of flames around her. When she pushed the door open, she saw a huddled figure pressed against a window that wouldn't unhinge. It was weak, it seemed, which made sense. The boy couldn't be very much younger than she had been all those years ago. She hadn't lasted very long either, and she didn't even have as much gasoline to hasten the blaze. Desperation was a feisty force, though, and he was surrounded by several broken objects destroyed in the crossfire, in an attempt to break the glass. It was humbling, in a way, to watch little Patrick Davis fall. The way he sunk to the ground, his breaths rattling in his chest, heavy and achingly final. It was a fate she knew well, even if it didn't ultimately take her life. A fate she'd escaped, even if he couldn't. Yes, her exposure therapy was going very well, her thoughts less consumed by the past. Dr. Harrison would be so proud of her. Just a few more tries, and she'd surely be healed. The typewriter clicked. It did so much of the time, even when there was no one there to use it. And while this usually wasn't the case, there were times that the old machine would sit abandoned on the antique wooden desk, or the granite kitchen countertop, or the plush couch cushions with the buzz of the TV droning in the background, and its strange rhythmic clicking would underlie each sound. It didn't often need to click on its own because, despite how old the typewriter was, it was well cared for and prized. But although those times were few and far between, that afternoon happened to be one of those times. That afternoon, a soft silver light poured in from the full moon, engulfing the small condo and the vast forest surrounding it in an ethereal haze. That afternoon, a normally peaceful and beautiful scene was made sinister and foreboding by the wickedness within its walls. It turned out that afternoon was a time for many things, because, chillingly, that afternoon, The owner of the typewriter with the phantom clicking was preparing to extinguish a phantom of his own. Graham Campbell hadn't always believed in the paranormal. In fact, he had made a conscious effort when settling down to write his novel to avoid those topics altogether. His writing style was romantic, tame, and free-flowing, not at all like the horror his time spent in his new home had turned out to be. Because a month and a half spent living there had convinced him that there was something more going on. During the late hours of the night that he would stay away clicking away on his typewriter, the peace would suddenly be pierced by a sound no settling home or animal could possibly make. Among them were low moans, creaking footsteps, and ominous murmurs that protruded from the basement and made Graham's hair stand on end. The first time he had heard it, he tried to go down to investigate with a frying pan raised bravely above his head, only to find absolutely nothing. Granted, he'd been too afraid to advance past the last stair-step, but from what he could tell, it was all normal. There was no trace of another human being, animal, or even monster in sight. He hadn't been able to sleep for hours after that, staring blankly and on edge at the whisper-thin cracks in the floorboards beneath his bed. No, it was safe to say that he hadn't always believed in the paranormal, but as time had gone on and the noises became more frequent, Graham had been unable to think of another plausible explanation for his circumstances. He had gone down to stand at the bottom of the stairs multiple times and had even sent one of his friends down there to look around completely. But all efforts came up empty-handed, and the friend was creeped out and just told him he was crazy. But occasionally, the source of these noises began to become tangible when some of his things began to go missing, only to either end up on the basement floor or around the condo in odd places. Hauntingly, the items that loved to disappear the most often were food and knives from his kitchen, and he thought that he discovered why when he did a few Google searches on the house to see who the hell could possibly be haunting him here. When he was done, he could finally put a name and face to the voice. Carver Price. The articles detailed a 22-year-old man with shaggy black hair, an overgrown beard, piercing green eyes, and sunken features. He seemed to have had no wife or kids, and while Graham couldn't find much else on his family, he did know that he was thought to be quite sick and twisted in the later years of his life. Speculation and rumors surged throughout the small town they lived in, and the harsher ones eventually proved to be true when Carver finally snapped. On November 14th, 1993, Carver Price murdered a young family of 4 on the very house that had stood here before Graham's condo had been built. David Page, Angela Page, and their children, Michael and Michelle, all had their throats cut. Their deaths were considered an immediate tragedy throughout the town, and Carver had been the prime suspect from the very beginning. In fact, it turns out that the crime itself had been quite messy, because they soon had irrefutable evidence to prove that he was the killer, including eyewitnesses placing a man matching his description at the house, a disturbing criminal record, and a suspicious lack of alibi. DNA results at the time were even pending. But despite the overwhelming evidence, he never had the chance to go to court or even to jail. Less than 2 weeks later, firemen responded to a house call from Carver Price. By the time they got to the small house across town, the entire building was up in smoke, and human bones and ashes were later found inside among the rubble. It was declared to be a self-set arson, which immediately caused a stir. But he was officially pronounced dead, the bones matching the general size and markers for Carver Price himself. So the town breathed an uneasy sigh of relief and soon chose to forget about the whole incident. One less thing to worry about, after all. But now, only 15 years later, that worry had resurfaced at last. Because Graham knew that he had the evil spirit of a murderer living in his own home. Or, more specifically, in the basement that the condo complex had decided to simply build over. After all, it was up to code enough for tenants to use it as extra storage space. It had been a general appeal of the place when he'd moved in. The realtor had used it as a selling point. Great. It wasn't like Graham knew what to do about evil spirits. Sure, in his lifetime he'd seen some television shows, but Hollywood twisted things so much he didn't even think those were very accurate. What other options did that leave him, though? Maybe that was how he had gotten here. His red hair was ruffled with worry, and anyone who looked at him could see the bags under his brown eyes and how his bottom lip was swollen and raw. But the strangest part about this scene wasn't Graham's appearance, or how he was standing in the middle of his living room wearing a bathrobe in the place of a ceremonial one. The strangest part wasn't that all the furniture had been moved to the walls to make room for the circle of sea salt and 3 white candles, positioned in a triangle around it. The strangest part wasn't the fact that it was a full moon, or that there were a few black rocks from a nearby vase in Graham's pocket for safekeeping, or that the entire condo smelled of sage from the incense lit near his clicking typewriter. No. The strangest part about this scene was that Graham's identical twin brother was here.
You know...
Eric Campbell pouted, having slumped back against the couch as he watched.
Most brothers greet their family with a hug, how you've been, and a fun night out. Not...
He gestured vaguely.
This.
It needs to be done, Graham said gravely, checking for any holes in the circle he'd created. And this is what the internet said to do to banish Carver.
Oh, the internet. Very reliable.
Eric snickered, kicking his feet up onto the coffee table.
Did the internet tell you to wear that?
Graham sighed, casting his gaze down to his bathrobe. They said to wear ceremonial robes, but I don't have those.
What, does not everyone have ceremonial robes? Get with the times, brother. You should have told me. I would have let you borrow one of mine. I've got one for every color of the rainbow.
Eric, please.
What? Come on, I'm just having fun.
Eric chuckled.
And speaking of, I still can't believe his name was Carver. It's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, don't you think?
Just get down here and help me, Graham scolded him. And stop being insensitive. I know you're a skeptic. I was too, but I need your help with this. Don't make me regret inviting you.
Great, and what is this, exactly?
Eric asked, raising an eyebrow at him.
You look ridiculous, and so does your new condo. Are you really telling me you're giving up everything because of a few noises?
Look, this is just the first thing I'm trying, Graham huffed, glaring up at him from his place on the floor, where he was lighting each of the candles as directed. If it doesn't work, I'll try something else. I'm not moving out unless I have to, but... Eric, if you heard what I hear every night, you'd be doing this too. Eric just stared at him for a moment before rolling his eyes.
Ungrateful, I tell you. Try living in a shitty apartment. You'd hear plenty of scary noises then.
Eric! Eric sighed loudly, but he eventually complied and got to his feet.
Fine, Jesus. You've already got me all the way here. Can't you just be satisfied with that?
Despite all of Eric's grousing, with the two of them combined, the brothers finished their preparations rather quickly. The sage was lit, the crucifixes were hung, and the Bibles were opened wide. All precautions had been taken to ensure that this ritual was as successful as possible. After all, as Graham later said, we can't take any chances. Once the stage had been set, Graham brushed the salt off of himself and stood up, earnestly setting his typewriter onto the desk where it would be safe. Then he picked up his phone to access the website he'd been looking at. Eric stood too and peered over his shoulder, confused.
What are you doing?
I've got to read this. It's a chant made to send him away.
What, you think you'll read this Carver guy a bedtime story and he'll just say, "Oh shit, I'm intruding, time to turn over a new leaf," and poof out of there? If he was a suicidal mass murderer in life, I sincerely doubt he'd be too reasonable now.
God, you are so crass, Graham scowled. Come on, can't you just let me do this?
Yeah, just get on with it, dumbass.
Eric snorted, ruffling his hair. Graham ignored him after that, turning to the top point of the white-candled triangle, which faced his staircase and the basement door. Admittedly, he'd been too afraid to actually do this in the basement itself, since he had no idea what this ghost would try to do to him once it knew he was trying to make it leave. All he could do now was cross his fingers and hope that this would work, casting Carver Price away from him and back to hell, where he belonged. O Spirit, that which resides here, with this circle of salt, sage, and rock of onyx, I am protected from your wrath. I speak to you now with respect and dignity, and I hope you will give me the same. Graham started, and then paused. Silence.
Hey, Ghostbuster, nothing's happening.
Eric whispered tauntingly, smirking when Graham glared at him fiercely.
Maybe read from the good book or something.
Again, Graham ignored him, and continued on. I understand that this house meant something to you in life, but it's where mine stands now. It would really mean a lot to me if you were to leave. Suddenly, Graham was cut off by a loud bang just beneath them, making he and Eric both jump in surprise and look at each other.
Holy shit,
Eric mumbled under his breath, his smug expression having completely dropped off his face. Graham turned to shakily continue as the typewriter kept on clicking in the background, now just a little faster than before. I know you're trapped here, but it's time for you to move on. You've been intruding on my life and now that of my brothers, and I only ask that... Another bang sounded from directly under their feet, and Eric's eyes widened when they heard a low moan coming from the basement, as if there was someone in pain. This time, though, he dared not interrupt Graham's machinations. In fact, he silently urged him to continue. I only ask that you respect our wishes and see that there is a light for you, Graham pleaded weakly, but he flinched when the moans turned into yells, and the banging became more violent. Lights began to flicker quickly on and off, and Graham realized with a sickening dread that the fuse box was down there.
Graham.
Eric started, looking truly afraid now.
What the fuck is this?
It's him, Graham said quietly, and then, stronger, Carver Price, you need to go home! And then, the banging stopped. Both boys were almost as startled by this as they had been when it started, and they gave each other a wary glance before either of them dared to speak.
Do you think it's over?
Eric began, before suddenly the basement door began to slam back against the lock, straining the hinges with the force of it. He yelped and ran over to hold it closed as the yells morphed into pained and angry howls, and Graham looked on in horror as his brother all but forced the door to stay shut. Eric yelled over the noise, his back pressed hard against the door. His entire body jolted forward and he was nearly thrown off the door entirely when a full weight was slammed into it, but he barely managed to stay put.
Graham, do something!
Graham could only open and close his mouth, useless and in shock for a few seconds before he stammered, Carver, you need to get out! You need to move on! But this wasn't enough. The door kept slamming, and it was clear that Eric was losing his hold. Sheer panic was written across his face, and Graham could tell that the same expression was mirrored on his own. He strained against the door, knuckles white and sweat beading on his forehead as he yelped in pain.
Graham!
Carver Price, leave this place at once! Graham shouted, cowering in the salt circle like he was drowning and it was his only lifeline. The typewriter was racing as the banging continued, louder and louder and louder, and Carver was still howling. Eric was screaming, or maybe it was he himself that was screaming, he couldn't tell. As the house seemed to crash down around them, the lights flickered before shutting down completely, all faster and louder and more intense until... everything stopped. The house was silent. and Graham Campbell dropped to his knees, knowing that the ghost was finally gone. The weeks following that incident were blissfully uneventful. While Graham used to be unable to get a few nights' sleep in a row without something from the basement disturbing him, he was able to sleep unperturbed for the next week. Finally, he felt well rested, and that alone would have been more than enough to focus on the novel he had been trying to write if it were not for Eric's constant, annoying presence. That being said, his brother didn't visit him often, so Graham was relatively happy overall to have him staying for a few days, despite how different a personality he had. The fact was, he just wasn't used to someone so wild and unpredictable. But even still, he was stunned to find that, a week and a half later, Eric left without saying anything. Graham wouldn't have even known this if he hadn't seen that his car was no longer in the driveway, with all his things cleared out. While this was rather odd, Eric could have easily gotten a call from work or from his girlfriend. This wasn't entirely outside the realm of possibility for his brother. Still, after a few attempts to contact him with no response, Graham made a mental note to call him again in a few days, just to make sure he was okay. He also made a mental note, not for the first time this week, to harass his electrician. Ever since Carver had been banished, all his lights had stopped working, and the internet had cut out as well. He assumed that Carver had messed with the fuse box or router somehow, which he was sure was possible for ghosts, though he didn't have the internet anymore to look it up. And all he had to do was get someone in to fix it at some point. His home phone still worked, though, and he still had leftover candles from the ritual, so both were put to good use during the inconvenience. Not for the first time, Graham found himself thanking anyone who could hear him that he had his trusty typewriter with him, as it had gone back to normal and still worked just fine. With it, he found that he could deal with just about everything going on around him. All he had to do was sit somewhere comfortable and immerse himself in his writing, comforted by the clicking his fingers made on the keys when they moved, as well as the clicking that went on when they didn't. It was steady and reliable, a sound he had just attuned his ear to, and a sound that he always managed to get used to and love. After all, just it being there meant he still had something stable to depend on. So a few days after his brother left, this was where Graham was, sitting at his old wooden desk in front of the windows overlooking the forest, the moon shining brightly overhead. Everything was peaceful now, and it felt like it had all gone back to normal as he consumed himself in his writing, oblivious in the face of his paranormal victory. In short, everything was perfect. Until it wasn't. Everything was perfect, until a loud bang startled Graham from his writing, making him sit up straight in his chair. No, that couldn't have been what he thought it was. But then there it was again, a loud crash coming right from the basement door. Graham started out of his seat, panic rising in his chest as he backed up against the bed. The basement door was right near the front entrance, and the back door was on the other side of the condo. There was no way he could get there in time from his bedroom, but he was being silly, of course. There was no way that a ghost could really hurt him. It was just a spirit, just some stupid old spirit that would scare him and then fade away. Just some stupid old spirit that couldn't really touch him. Just some stupid old spirit that was now standing in his doorway. And of course, Carver Price had actually looked like that. Of course he had had silver hair and wrinkles before. Because spirits couldn't age. Right? Graham collapsed against the bedpost, staring wide-eyed at the man now in front of him. He was thin and sunken, just like in the pictures, but there was something unmistakably older about him now. And there was certainly something more intimidating about one of Graham's previously missing kitchen knives glistening between his fingertips. dripping in blood that wasn't his own and wearing clothes that looked suspiciously like the ones his twin brother had worn the day he had arrived. This was no spirit. It couldn't have been. Graham hardly even registered the small cry of anguish and fear that bubbled up from deep inside him, escaping through his lips in an unspoken plea for mercy. Nor did he register the fact that the closer Carver got, the faster the typewriter steadily clicked. As he pressed himself back against the wall like he hoped to disappear right through it, Graham couldn't help but think that if he'd gone just a bit further into the basement rather than lingering near the stairs each time, this could have been prevented. As he begged one last desperate time for Carver to spare him from this horrible fate, Graham knew that if he had called the police rather than his brother, maybe they wouldn't be in this mess. If he'd gone out on the isolated forest roads to see his brother's car crashed and hit and flipped over in a ditch, if he'd called the electrician one last time to force them to come in sooner and tell him all the power lines to his condo had been completely severed, if he'd not assumed the culprit was a spirit, if he had done this, if he had done that, if he had just not been so stupid. But he had been. Now, he would pay the price. Because as everyone can be sometimes, Graham had been rather stupid. In fact, not only can people be stupid as well as genius, but humans can be primal as well as civilized. When looking to survive in a hard, unforgiving place, the simplest of people can become creatures of pure, animalistic instinct. And as a madman slunk out of hiding and the moon disappeared behind a cloud, Graham knew he should have had some way of knowing that he himself would be victim to the opposite of what he had expected. Not someone who died, but someone with a damaged mind who had fought tooth and nail to survive. A man, not a spirit, who had killed and hidden himself away in an old foul basement for months just to keep what he had. A man who then killed just for fun and taught himself to take pleasure out of it. A man who was good at surviving. And Graham thought then that if only he had been a little more keen on surviving himself, perhaps he would have. Perhaps he would have been okay. But instead, he screamed. The killer retreated. The typewriter stopped clicking. Oh, hello, listeners. You're back. Welcome. Yes, I'm sorry for the low volume, but partway through that last story, Jackal and Clue stopped staring at each other and are now just staring at me. I'm currently looking through the instructions Everett left me to see if he told me what to do in this situation. Let's see. If a fire starts at the station, Blackwell family history, how to appease the Dream Lords, let's see, ritual sacrifice for dummies, gummy bears versus real bears, how to decide at a picnic. Here we go. If the statue in front of the Blackwell estate animates and refuses to leave, Jackal Blackwell engages in a staring contest with them, and then they won't stop staring at you. Perfect. All right. Oh! Well, that's nice. Okay, Everett says here that they're merely paying me a compliment. Clue trusts that the radio station is a safe place to learn how to gain full function, and Jackal is telling me that he really enjoyed the story. Phew! That makes me feel a whole lot better. Wait. Okay, it also says here that if I blink or look away, I'll, quote, be torn asunder to all the ends of Sturgeon, devoured by Kaio's blood god, and wiped from the metaphysical plane. Alright, so, I guess I just won't blink, then. Sounds easy enough, right? Okay, well, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out some of our other transmissions. We're adding them regularly, and we'd love to have you as part of the Dusklight family by subscribing, hitting the bell of the giant anthill in the park, and leaving a comment with stories you'd love for Everett's many-legged runners to find. Now, while I think very hydrated thoughts, let us thank our lovely Sturgeonite faithfuls. Haley Clark, Foe, PRDDL12, Sabrina Alexander, Jason Webb, and Laurie W. Purple Crayon Eaters Mary Peck, Square, Gianni Di Lorena, Feeney Von Karma, and Max, who seem to have begun doodling on all the landmarks of Sturgeon in the middle of the night, which city officials say tanks their historic value, but secretly admit actually improves their appearance. Janitors Alex Nunez, Amy Shawn, Ethan Nelson, and Arkham Cookie, who are methodically taking every single strand of fiber from the bottoms of their brooms and laying them in various places around your house. So, keep an eye out, I guess. Our nightmare detective, Adrian Rodriguez, who has begun his newest case by walking up and down the street pleading, "I know who the killer is! I've told everyone I know! I saw it happen! Why won't anyone acknowledge me?" Good luck, Adrian. I'm sure you'll solve it soon. Our void walker, Evan Diaz, who is following a trail of cookie crumbs into the woods, which shows an absolute lack of self-preservation. For the person who left them behind, that is. And of course, our Blackwell family members. Clue Blackwell, who has started twitching uncontrollably again in some kind of unpredictable back and forth sway. Is that a compliment too, or? Tabitha Blackwell, who struck gold in the mines earlier this week and has been thoroughly enjoying eating every last piece of it. Oh, congratulations, Tabitha. Save us a slice for the next Blackwell barbecue if you can. Jackal Blackwell, who can really hold his eyes open for such a long time. Listeners, this is getting exceedingly difficult. And, our Lord of Blood and Bone, Papa Kaio Blackwell, who has recently discovered the phrase girl dinner and has taken it to mean that the price for staying loyal to the hobo queen has just gone up. Expect an uptick of bone shards and strangely textured blood this week, listeners, and stay vigilant out there. We love you and fear you, Papa. We thank you humbly for your patronage and look to see you bright and early for Dusklight orientation. Purple crayons and existential dread will be provided. If you want to be a patron, we have a link in the description below. You'll get early access to all videos, exclusive Sturgeon-focused D&D/Monster of the Week content, and more. And one last time, listeners, close your eyes as I try not to close mine, and breathe with me. Remember, no matter how bad things are, how cruel people can be, and how heavy your shoulders may feel with the weight of the world bearing down on them, Dusklight will always be here to lift the load and provide you with some respite. Drink a strawberry kiwi Capri Sun, have some dino-shaped nuggies, watch a video about dogs cuddling with babies, and sleep on the cool side of the pillow with the window open and the stars twinkling down on you. Start and end each day with kindness in your heart. You matter. You are loved. And every day is another chance. Okay. I can't do this anymore. I think I have to blink now. So, wish me luck. And hopefully I'll see you all again when the sun sets and dusk enters the station.